It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Joel Faflach. He is professor in the Department of English and Writing Studies at Western University, where he was inaugural director of the School for Advanced Studies in the Arts and Humanities from 2012 to 2017. He's also visiting professor at Victoria College, University of Toronto. He's the author of Romantic Psychoanalysis, co-author of Revelation and Knowledge, editor of De Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, co-editor of Palgrave Studies in Affect Theory and Literary Criticism, and editor of many essay collections. He's currently working on two book projects, one entitled Romantic Psychiatry and the Psychopathology of Happiness, and the other entitled Get Happy, the Politics of Utopianism in the American Film Musical. Dr. Faflak, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Martha. Thank you for the invitation to talk today. And I'm thrilled to be in such amazing company and to hear the amazing two talks that we just heard just before the break. So thank you again. I have to say we are renovating our entire downstairs, mostly our kitchen. So we have workers in the background who are playing greatest hits of the 60s and 70s, mostly heavy metal. And I am loath to go down and tell them to turn it down or to leave, because we really need the renovation done. So if you hear music in the background, a little music in the background, well, I may be better than my talk, so just listen to the music. I had to laugh when Carol put forward the notion of the fact that a happy and an unhappy partners in a marriage wouldn't work out, because my partner and I just celebrated 30 years together, and I'm the unhappy one and he's very much the happy one. He's a registered nurse, now retired, working 32 years in frontline nursing and neurology and neurosurgery, and he would get out of bed every morning at 5 o'clock singing, and I would just want to tell him to off, you know, because it was really annoying. So over a period of years, however, he's weaned me over into happiness. God love him. Although for the last 3 years doing frontline nursing, he was not singing in the morning, I have to say, getting out of bed, understandably so. And now he's immunizing for the pandemic. Great job that he's doing. Anyway, I digress. My research starts, Martha mentioned my first book, Romantic Psychoanalysis. So I'll just go through a kind of genealogy of where my idea of happiness comes from and where it's headed, as it were. My first book, as I say, Romantic Psychoanalysis, I was interested in looking at the origins of psychoanalysis before Freud, specifically in the late 18th and the early 19th century, specifically British Romantic literature and Romantic poetry, very specifically, which always brings the dinner conversation to a complete halt when you say something like that. And I actually say that because part of my mission when I was director of the School for Advanced Studies, which I started and ran for 6 years, was to promote the arts and humanities and the necessity of the arts and humanities and the necessity of the kinds of things that we do, as it were. And specifically because the arts and humanities are so much about the kind of interrogation of happiness, speculation, rumination, meditation. All of these things don't necessarily lead to happiness. Or the illusion of happiness, or they're very much about critiquing the illusion of happiness, which is very much what so much of my research is about. I was led to look at the origins of psychoanalysis before Freud. Of course, Freud, who, you know, is the person who famously says to us, you know, the idea of combating madness or mental illness, it's up to fate, but we can learn to live with ordinary or common unhappiness, and that's the best that we can do. And of course, he gets that from someone like Schopenhauer. I'm working on an essay on Schopenhauer right now. And, you know, Schopenhauer's pessimism is, of course, one way in which we can think about the work that he does. But of course, the other way we can think about the work that he does is to get us used to what common unhappiness might mean, or ordinary unhappiness might mean. And that's important to me because, once again, it pierces through the illusion of happiness. I was happy to see Martha put up Sarah Ahmed's work on the promise of happiness. And I also think of Lauren Berlant's work, you know, Cruel Optimism, the ideal of a future, of a utopian future, of the ideal or the promise of happiness is one of the cruelest things that we've instituted. In looking back at the origin of psychoanalysis, I was therefore not interested in, of course, you know, I mean, it doesn't have a scientific or a medical or a clinical language before Freud gives it one. But of course, as Freud says, he didn't invent psychoanalysis, or he didn't discover the unconscious. The poets and philosophers did that before him. And so in the late 18th and early 19th century, I went back to look in the literature that I'm most passionate about, specifically Romantic poetry, where various scenes of psychoanalysis emerged, where people share, as it were, their deeper thoughts with one another. And there is given at that particular moment in time to the work of psychopathology, or what we now pathologize as psychopathology, affective and emotional and psychological states that society is anxious about, or terrorized by, or anxious to eliminate, as it were. In these scenes of psychoanalysis, those states are given what I would call an affective and cognitive dignity, without fear of reprisal, as it were, a kind of honesty and openness to what these states of being might mean emotionally and psychologically. Of course, Coleridge, the poet, philosopher Coleridge, actually coins the term psychoanalytical in 1805 to refer to fugitive or transgressive states of being, things that bypass the consciousness, our consciousness and the consciousness of individuals and society as a whole. So these scenes of psychoanalysis, as I say, give these moments a cognitive and affective dignity that it wouldn't otherwise have. So that was my first book, but I didn't really delve into the history of medicine, or I mean, it was a more theoretical book, and it was more abstract from that point of view, and dealt purely with the aesthetic, quote unquote, purely with the aesthetic and the aesthetic realm. In the process of doing that, of course, I was also aware of the fact that while psychoanalysis doesn't emerge as an official, quote unquote, discipline at this particular moment in time, psychiatry does. The actual word psychiatry is coined by Johann Christian Ryle, German physician, philosopher, a theorist. And of course, Ryle's idea, and this emerges out of the Enlightenment, at a post-Enlightenment time, the elimination of man. We can eliminate madness from the face of the earth. And of course, this coincides with the huge optimism that coincides with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and the idea of liberty and freedom. Liberty and freedom from the things that oppress the mind, and madness being the ultimate symptom of that, as it were. The idea that we can finally eliminate madness from the face of the earth. And of course, this goes along with, Jeremy Bentham's idea of the greatest happiness for the greater number. And I love the way he phrases that, the greatest happiness, the ideal of the greatest, but then he gives us the comparative greater for the number. That is to say, we have to put this happiness into practice. And the minute we think about putting into practice, it becomes rather problematic. So the book that I'm working on now, or one of the two books I'm working on now, is about the rise of psychiatry in the Romantic period. And what I didn't look at in my first book and my earlier research, I think I was caught up in a kind of utopianism or idealism myself about the fact that psychoanalysis, the spirit of psychoanalysis, I don't mean psychoanalysis with a capital P, I mean the spirit of the investigation of the unconscious, without fear of reprisal and without an attempt to codify it. Freud gives it a clinical language, a metapsychological language, but the Romantics give it a kind of symbolic language, and therefore don't attempt to contain it, as it were. So as I say, I was a little utopian about that expressiveness in the Romantic period. What I hadn't bargained for, and I'm very glad I've delved into this further in terms of looking at the emergence of psychiatry, is of course the emergence of its ideological imperative, if I can put it that way. And the emergence also of a kind of psychiatric capitalism, because we're talking about psychiatry emerging along with democratic capitalism at this particular moment in time. On one hand, the idealism and the utopianism that corresponds to eliminating madness, and why wouldn't we want that? Why wouldn't we want absolute happiness, as it were, that comes with the elimination of madness? Except that, of course, what also emerges is the institution of psychiatry and what that might possibly mean. And with the emergence of the institution of psychiatry, we also therefore have, Foucault's idea of the compartmentalization of certain forms of the psyche, and the biopolitics of managing populations, especially unwieldy, exponentially growing populations. Andrew Scull, a famous psychiatric historiographer, argues that, of course, there's an explosion of asylums from the 18th and into the early 19th century, starting with something like the York Retreat in the 1780s. Philippe Clignel at the Bicêtre Asylum in Paris, of course, who famously unchained the mad and said that, we have to start treating them more benevolently. We have to start treating the mad more benevolently. We have to start talking to them. We have to try to understand the socio-historical circumstances. We have to, as it were, attempt to reintegrate them into society. And once again, there's an idealism or utopianism that corresponds with that, a kind of benevolence that corresponds with that. But at the same time, there is very much the Foucauldian notion of the control of populations. And psychiatry, from that point of view, the minute it tries to address itself to eliminating madness, realizes simultaneously, as it were, that the jig is up, that you can't control madness, which is to say you can't contain psychopathology. And we know this because the first diagnostic and statistics manual was, this thin, and now it's like this big. The more you try to put your finger on eliminating the work of the psyche, the more its florid imagination will exponentially move beyond our capacity to deal with it. So then what else is going on at that particular moment in time? There's a kind of implicit awareness of failure built into that. Owen Woolley has recently written on, it's called a book called On the Heels of Ignorance, Psychiatry and the Politics of Not Knowing. And psychiatry reinvents itself over and over again, based particularly on its episodes of failure. Starting with the 18th and early 19th century, Freud and psychoanalysis being another episode in that history of failure, as it were. How do we reinvent the wheel in order to keep the system, as it were, of psychiatry moving forward? Andrew Scull says, of course, especially in the Victorian period, asylums proliferated precisely out of a kind of failure. That is to say, they proliferated, but they didn't really deal with the issue. They didn't really deal with the issue at all. And this is, of course, what Owen Woolley picks up on in his book. But there is, as I say, this impetus towards, towards happiness and towards benevolence. Humphrey Davy writes, I got to put my glasses on and make sure I read this. Humphrey Davy, of course, the famous chemist, late 18th, early 19th century, writes in one of his notebooks, "Life is only estimable in proportion as it is the means of our perceiving pleasurable sensations. A considerable portion of both our happiness and misery depends on our mutual relations. The laws of our existence order us in our connection with society to search for our individual pleasure, and our private pleasure is wisely connected with that of our fellow creatures. Thus, man is impelled to be a social being, is impelled to promote the happiness of his fellow creatures on account of its connection with his own happiness. He is," and this is the key phrase for me, "obliged to be benevolent." He is obliged to be benevolent. And that corresponds to something that Slavoj Žižek wrote recently in a 2008 book, In Defense of Lost Causes, about what's become our biomorality. Even the Dalai Lama is on board about this, bringing happiness to the world, as it were. And, Žižek says happiness has become our supreme duty, the biomorality of happiness. This has all become our supreme duty. And of course, he's taking aim at New Age psychology and all sorts of things. And he's taking aim precisely at the kinds of things that Carroll's work represents, which I hasten to add is absolutely necessary work to take place, and I completely applaud it. So Žižek has an axe to grind when he's taking aim at the economics of happiness, as it were. Yet, nonetheless, the ideology of happiness, if I can put it that way, is what interests me in all of this. I mean, I'm compelled by the fact that, in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, where that comes from. Well, it comes from John Locke, life, liberty, and the protection of property, as it were. Well, the founding fathers eliminated the protection of property. Why? Because they didn't want slaves to have access to property. So they instituted as part of that the pursuit of happiness as their third objective. Interestingly, and Vivasan Sani writes about this in a book called Morning Happiness, when it came time to institutionalize, as it were, to codify the Declaration of Independence in the American Constitution, the pursuit of happiness goes kind of missing. And that it goes missing, which is a different form of its failure, as it were, of a recognition of its illusion, is to ask the fact, well, what does that entail? What does that mean? What's a symptom of, as it were? It means that the failure of happiness goes underground, but that it resurfaces in a different kind of way, which is, I argue, getting people used to the idea of happiness, not the goal of happiness, but the desire for happiness, if I can put it that way, to use a Lacanian terminology. The desire for the desire of happiness. As Lauren Berlant reminds us, or Sarah Ahmed reminds us, happiness is an impossible goal, as it were. But if you institute it as something, and the idea of benevolence, as Žižek says, is a kind of biomorality, and you encoded ideologically in how a society runs itself and how a civil society constructs itself or organizes itself, you have a kind of recipe for a certain kind of disaster, but hopefully a recipe for success, or a recipe for a kind of success that's built on the disaster of happiness, which is to say the failure of happiness. Over and over and over again, you get people striving for it over and over and over again. And of course, this very much corresponds with the rise of democratic capitalism, the planned obsolescence of happiness, if I can put it that way. And to go back to the Romantic period, so much of what I'm looking at in terms of other scenes of psychiatry as opposed to scenes of psychoanalysis, although the two collapse into one another, are scenes where Romantic writers are confronting this failure, as it were, and trying to come up with a more pragmatic, doable solution, as it were, actually trying to come up with an understanding of what common unhappiness or ordinary unhappiness might mean for society. You know, and they're compelled, people like William Godwin, for instance, who writes, you know, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, the idea that conversation, relationality via conversation is going to eliminate the need for institutions altogether. We're simply going to rationally be able to talk to one another and get along, which is a kind of early form of psychoanalysis, if you want to put it that way. You know, simultaneously realizes the failure of that. Bentham's idea, you know, as I say, going from greatest to greater, encrypts the failure of happiness in a certain kind of way. So they're also aware at this moment in time of the emergence of what I would call a psychiatric consciousness. You know, what does that consciousness entail? And on one hand, of course, it once again corresponds to the ideals of revolution, reformation, transformation, progress, moving society forward. But it also becomes a way, as I've already said, of managing populations, the necessity of managing populations. It really helps when you need to get workers to the factory 6, almost 7 days a week, as De Quincey's aware of in Confessions of an English Opium Eater. And, you know, letting them drink their brains out on a Saturday night and take as much opium as they want is great, because it means that they can rest on Sunday and they'll be productive when they come back to work on Monday. There's also a kind of insidiousness built into the idea of the emergence of psychiatry at this moment in time. Someone like David Marshall and also Vivas and Sani writes about this in terms of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. You know, the scene of sympathy, the emergence of sensibility in this particular moment in time, and the triumphing of feelings and affect. Is embedded within the scene of sympathy. You know, the idea that people, once again, like Godwin's idea of conversation, people are going to rationally get along with one another. They're going to rationally be able to share their feelings with one another. But the scene of sympathy for Marshall or for Sani is insidious to the extent that it's about witnessing someone else's pain and suffering. It's about witnessing someone else's pain and suffering, vicariously experiencing their pain and suffering, and yet not really having to participate in it, as it were. So, you know, it's the idea of, it's sympathy as opposed to empathy, right? Empathy is more radical. Empathy means a kind of recognition of, your pain and suffering is your own. I can witness it, and I will do what I can here to deal with it, but I can't get inside. I can't claim it, as it were. I can't colonize it, which is, as I say, the darker side of psychiatry as it emerges at this moment in time. An attempt through this scene of sympathy to lay claim to the feelings of others at the same time that you can remove yourself from that scene of sympathy. And of course, there's very much a racial imperative here, which goes very much to Martha's talk about how much white people can claim Black experience. I just finished teaching Shelley's Prometheus Unbound in conjunction with Mary Prince's history of Mary Prince. One of the first slave narrative by a Black woman published in the United Kingdom. I'm sure there were others published, but this is the first one published in the United Kingdom. And I was trying to get my students to think about that scene of psychiatry, as it were, simply by putting those two texts together. Shelley's poem works so much by sound, and the sound of revolution, and the sonic vocabulary, as opposed to the gaze, which always, of course, colonizes the other. And of course, this corresponds very much to the sound of pain and suffering, the weeping that recurs over and over and over again in Mary Prince's narrative, the pain and suffering that's, of course, encrypted, embedded within spirituals, that slaves would have sung. And that's the sound of resistance and, you know, the sound of pain and suffering. That's the sound of oppression, and at the same time, implicitly, the sound of resilience and a possible transformation within that oppression. The work of Fred Moten and Christina Sharp, and a book called The Meaning of Soul, Emily Lorda, I think. You know, the issue of what are we hearing when we hear that music, and where does that sound go, and how does it inform our human experience? All of these things inform how I think about the rise of romantic psychiatry. You know, I mean, it eventuates in something like the talking cure and the idea of sharing our feelings with one another. But there's also something that also always escapes our attention in that particular moment in time. But escaping our attention and the transformational possibility that comes with that doesn't really wash for me at the end of the day, because I think the ideology of happiness ends up winning out, as it were. Or I want to ask the question, and I'll end up sounding rather pessimistic about all of this, I suppose. I mean, at the end of the day, the ideology of happiness wins out. I was very influenced by a piece in Harper's Magazine by Gary Greenberg, who wrote a great book called Manufacturing Depression. He was a depressive himself. And he went to, many, many years ago, he went to a positive psychology conference in Anaheim, California, of all places. And the article is called The War Against Unhappiness. I forget what the subtitle is, but it's basically an attack on, of course, psychoanalysis and Freud. And what struck me the most, really one of the most powerful things I've read, and you know, what struck me the most about that was the triumph of positive psychology. And once again, I'm not here to diss the outcome of positive psychology and the need for cognitive behavioral therapy, so forth and so on, the need for reaching out for these things when psychic pain and suffering is such that you can't do anything else, the need for pharmaceuticals to do that, as it were. But, you know, as Carol's already suggested, we've seen, you know, we've also seen what's happened with the opioid crisis. Greenberg's point in this particular essay is that one of these outcomes, via the work of Martin Seligman, you know, the guy who, you know, the experiments about shocking dogs and learned helplessness, and you know, what could be done to overcome depression as a form of learned helplessness. One of the eventualities of that was, of course, that they hired Martin Seligman. The American Department of Defense hired Seligman to the tune of $10 to $15 billion a year, specifically during the time of the Iraq War. I don't have the details of this absolutely straight, so don't quote me on this. But the basic narrative is this: instead of dealing with the cost of PTS, you know, post-traumatic stress syndrome from soldiers when they come off the battlefield, let's arm them with happiness before they go onto the battlefield, and they'll be better soldiers. They'll be able to deal with the death, necessarily, obviously, the death and the violence that they're going to be experiencing. So I get that on one hand. But of course, it's an inverse of the Orientalist, stereotype, right, of Muslim hordes being hopped up on opium, and how are we going to possibly defeat them? And it's a different form of this, right? Well, now we're going to send them into battle with happiness, and they're going to be able to, as it were, overcome defeat and overcome the trauma of violence and of death, so forth and so on. That really struck with me. And the fact that somehow this emergence of a psychiatric consciousness has ended up producing that. An interim episode, which is where I get the title of my talk from today, God Happy, is, pardon me for making a leap here, but is the emergence of the American film musical. And this came totally by accident to me, because I just didn't think film musicals were anything I could ever write about in my scholarship, because of course growing up, you know, you just didn't do this or whatever. And of course I had a father who thought film musicals were horrible and I couldn't possibly deal with them. And I remember saying this to my psychoanalyst one day. I said, I can't write on this because it's not serious stuff or whatever. I said, look at the Sound of Music, for God's sakes. What could be more innocuous than the Sound of Music? And he leaned over quietly from behind me and said, well, you do remember they were running away from the Nazis, Joel. Said, oh yeah, okay, thank you, Dr. Schaffelberg. That made a kind of sense to me. That, and when I started doing investigations into the rise of the American film musical, I gave a talk to a group of retired academics, not just retired academics, God forbid, also a broader audience, as it were. And at the end of that talk, where I talk about the rise of film musicals, and I'll talk briefly about that, and then and then wrap things up. And Martha, you'll tell me, because I haven't been keeping track of time. You'll put up your hand or something. Okay. Anyway, at the end of that talk, a woman came up to me. And of course, the place I got my love of musicals was my mother. And, she would, she would keep me up late at night so I could watch these things. It was a sort of covert operation that my father didn't know about. This woman, roughly my mother's age, came up to the end of the talk with tears in her eyes. It's quite moving. And she said, in the 1930s, we had no money whatsoever. We lived through the Depression. We were children of the Depression. There were 5 children. My father would save up enough money to take us to the movies once a month. And every time we went, he took us to a film musical. And those film musicals got us through the Depression. And I thought to myself, Jesus, what's going on? What's going on in a statement like that? How is it that seeing a film musical helped this woman, I don't want to say survive, but it was a mode of survival, of course, of a certain kind, a mode of survival against all odds, as it were. That fascinated me, and that got me to leaven my idea of how I was looking at film musicals. In terms of, and Martha put up, the phrase political technology. The subtitle for my book was going to be The Political Technology of Utopianism in American Film Musicals. It basically goes like this. With the birth of sound, of course, we have the birth of the American film musical. And one of the first forms of the American film musical is, of course, the Depression musicals that were done at Warner Brothers. And these were the show within the show musicals, right? A show within the show musical, showing you how to put on a better show. Something like 42nd Street. The show can't go on because we don't have enough money for it. And Broadway is this horrible place, cynical, and the Depression is, and how are we going to put on the show? And how are we going to, as it were, get happy? So those musicals were about the process of putting people back to work, and happiness being the necessary thing to get people back to work. And therefore there was a positive potential. There was a positive imperative behind this. But the idea of manufacturing happiness in order to get people back on the line, as it were, and back out to work, I found that incredibly moving, both from a transformational point of view and also from an ideological point of view. And the two things happen together simultaneously. And I thought to myself, well, those early musicals, we think they're black and white, they're fairly jingoistic, they're fairly black and white in so many ways, and they don't really tell a complex story. So then I moved forward to, Meet Me in St. Louis. Everybody's gone off to war, and Vincent Minnelli does this amazing color film with Judy Garland, his wife at the time, about the domestic situation in St. Louis, around the turn of the century in 1900, the St. Louis Fair, putting America on the map at the beginning of the American century. And how the musical manufactures, the mechanics of the domestic space, as it were, to counter with the violence of what's going on with the troops fighting halfway around the world. And then we move into the 1950s, where musicals have their heyday. The Bandwagon, Singing in the Rain, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Oklahoma, South Pacific, all of these, as it were. And they have their heyday in the 50s, and those are the most complex, I thought, the most complex versions of musicals happened in the 1950s with the Freed unit at MGM, so forth and so on. And that made a certain kind of sense to me as well. Interestingly, their heyday when psychoanalysis in America as ego psychology, not what Freud, as Lacan says, not Freud's idea, ego psychology, the idea that the ego can battle all of its enemies and overcome these enemies. Of course, this corresponds with post-World War II optimism, an optimism that, of course, corresponds at the same time with an intense paranoia because of the Cold War and because of McCarthy at home, as it were. So musicals, as it were, constellating all of this in the 1950s in interesting ways. And at the end of that, they fall into disrepute, or they start to darken, which is to say you have West Side Story, of course, based on a tragic story itself, Romeo and Juliet. And you have the failure of the musicals. You have their brief moment of, Sound of Music, a film music that made more money than any other film besides Gone with the Wind, I think, at that particular moment in time. But then the really darker forms like Cabaret, all that jazz, so forth and so on. So, my work divides halfway between the optimism leading up to the 1950s and then the breakdown or the darkening of that utopianism after that. And I'm interested in the survival of the film musical now. Lars von Trier's Dancer in the Dark, Dreamgirls, Sweeney Todd, Chicago, so forth and so on. And I'm interested in why that survives, as it were. And it occurred to me that the reason that film musicals fell out of favor in the 1950s, however, was because they'd actually done their ideological work, right? That is to say, they had embedded, coming after the Depression into the 40s, onto the 50s, this idea of happiness in people's minds in America, but also, of course, via the cultural industry that is Hollywood, on a global scale. This idea of absolute benevolence, of absolute happiness. So they didn't need to be around any longer because they'd already done their work, which is where the critique of them starts to settle in, dealing with the fallout of the end of the 1960s, the oil wars at the beginning of the 1970s, Watergate, so forth and so on, the disillusionment that comes with that. As you remember, at the beginning of Rocky Horror Picture Show, Janet and Brad are listening to Nixon's resignation speech in their car in the film, just before they go into Frankenfurter's castle. Anyway, that narrative held up to a certain extent until I went back and looked at Gold Diggers of 1935 and the Lullaby of Broadway number in the middle of that. And in the middle of that film, Busby Berkeley stages this huge spectacle, if you're familiar with Busby Berkeley's amazing spectacles, as it were, where you have, the Broadway baby, the woman who sleeps all day and then goes off and parties all night. And this number, I wish I could play it for you, but it's 13 minutes long, builds and builds and builds and builds. And she's at this nightclub and there's this gorgeous choreography, this gorgeous black and white, this amazing spectacle, in the middle of which, of course, you're completely taken away from the mise en scène, the realistic mise en scène, the realistic narrative of the film musical, into this completely utopian world, right? Which is, of course, the break between narrative and numbers that people like Richard Dyer have written about, which sustains the structure of film musicals over and over again. Why do you have people suddenly breaking into song? How can this possibly happen? And it's a break from reality. Well, it's not a break from reality, because what happens in that particular number is they sing and dance, and they sing her up to a particular balcony, and then there's a set of doors overlooking, it's like a nightclub at the top of a skyscraper, and they push her out the window to her death. And I'm like, why would you build this moment of intense tragedy into this utter tragedy, into this moment of utter utopianism and idealism? And it occurred to me that there is, in this emergence of a kind of psychiatric consciousness, the emergence of a kind of political technology of utopianism, embedded or encrypted with that is, once again, this idea of the impossibility of hope, right? The impossibility of happiness. You have to build in a kind of an attention to death and an attenuation of death simultaneously, such that you get people used to the melancholy of that, but they don't really have to experience the melancholy of that. So they get used to it and not used to it simultaneously, if I can put it that way. And, as Vivas Insani says in his book, Morning Happiness, this is different from the Solonian idea, the ancient, it's, that we only going to know happiness when we reach the end of our lives, as it were. Happiness is always a compromised situation, a necessarily compromised situation. Somehow, when that gets rewritten in the 18th and the 19th century via the rise of psychiatry and other things, he doesn't talk about psychiatry in particular, but for somehow, it turns into a crisis. It turns into something that has to be managed, as opposed to just pragmatically dealt with or confronted, as it were. It has to be managed, and it has to be turned into a kind of illusion. As I say, it has to be turned into a desire for the desire for happiness, so that you get attuned to dealing with the crisis of that. You get attuned to dealing with disaster, as it were. And of course, this is very much embedded in the ideology of capitalism itself, as we've seen it try to, crash in 2008, but resurrect itself and try. And, to go to Carol's point, I really hope that we're in a process of legitimately and realistically overturning so many of those things that we thought were going to repeat themselves in the sake of creating, returning to a better civil society and creating profitability in so many ways for ourselves. But hopefully we're changing the game, as it were. Hopefully we're changing the rules of the game. Hopefully we're changing people's minds in this process. But I think, simultaneously with that is a persistence of a kind of, as I say, ideology of happiness that survived in something like the triumph of pharmaceuticals, the triumph of pharmacology. If we can't ideologically affect how people deal, the most effective way ideologically to deal with happiness and to embed it in people's minds is to literally put it in their veins, literally put it in their veins. And at the end of the day, if all else fails, we'll just do that. We'll just give them the pills. And as I say, I want to be clear, there's a necessity for that, is of course, absolute necessity for that in cases of intense pain and suffering. but it's also produced something else, like the opioid crisis, as a way of not being able to manage crises and not being able to manage psychopathological states or states of affective and cognitive dissonance that we necessarily confront as part of the human experience.
That's about your time, Joel.
We'll just stop there. I just want to say one final thing. I talked to my University of Toronto students and I asked them about their happiness and what happiness meant for them at this particular moment in time. And they gave me the most interesting response. None of the white students replied. None of the white or Asian students replied to this question. They were silent. I tried to get them to talk. They wouldn't. All of the non-white students, besides those two groups, however, said, we just take one day at a time, and we're happy to take one day at a time, and we're happy to keep working, and we're happy to, and I thought to myself, on one hand, wow, we have really helped you buy into the ideology of happiness. And at the same time, there was a kind of implicit recognition of unhappiness and the confrontation with that I found quite moving. So that gave me hope. I had to come give you some kind of hope at the end of this. I wanted to show us Judy Garland's Get Happy, but we don't have time for that. Thanks, Martha.